Susan and John met on a blind date, built a beautiful family together, and raised 2 children, but nobody knew that one day this man would. Find out the hard way what it truly means to meet someone blind. Help this channel grow like the video. Try the new hype feature. Drop a comment and subscribe for more stories. It really helps us a lot. The heartbreaking events we're diving into today unfolded in Coral Gables, a calm but high-class city, sitting just about 11 kilometers from Miami. Coral Gables is one of the most affluent areas in South Florida, a place where every corner looks like it came straight out of a travel magazine. Thick green avenues twist through peaceful neighborhoods, spotless roads run past luxury homes, and the whole city feels like something built for perfection. Everywhere you look, there are historic landmarks, world-class restaurants, and scenes that make you want to stop and stare. Wide roads, tall trees, clean lawns, and stunning Mediterranean-style architecture fill the area, with plazas and fountains that make the whole place feel unreal. And right in the middle of this picture-perfect city lived the Sutton family. Susan Marrier met John Sutton back in 1974 on a blind date, and from the moment they locked eyes, it was like lightning hit the room. Things moved fast, and within a year, Susan officially became Mrs. Sutton. Their connection was strong because their lives were cut from the same cloth. John's father worked for a manufacturing company, and they lived comfortably in a Pittsburgh suburb with a big house, a backyard perfect for family time, and even their own swimming pool. Growing up, John had everything he needed, and he promised himself he would give his future family that same level of comfort and love. Susan, on the other hand, was known for her beauty and her presence. In her senior year of high school, she was the prom queen, the type of person who walked into a room and naturally became the center of attention. She graduated college and built a career as a nurse in a surgical intensive care unit, a job only someone with serious strength could handle. Working in an operating room meant staying calm under pressure, handling emotional moments, facing life and death situations, and helping people rebuild their lives afterward. Susan carried all of that on her shoulders with determination and heart. John was on his own journey to success, graduated from the University of Miami School of Law, became an attorney, and climbed his career ladder with focus and ambition. Both of their careers were rising fast, and everything in their lives looked like the start of a perfect story. After the wedding, the natural next step was having children. They had everything couples dream about: financial stability, happiness, health, and a relationship that felt strong and unbreakable. Susan was ready to become a mother right away, expecting things to happen quickly, since she and John were both young and healthy. But after several attempts and many months of waiting, everything changed when the Suttons got news that hit like a punch to the chest. Doctors told them Susan was infertile, and that information crushed the dream they had been building together. Hearing something like that is the kind of moment that shakes a couple to their core. Some partners grow closer and hold on to each other tighter, while others fall apart because the emotional weight becomes too heavy to carry. For the Suttons, this was the beginning of a storm they never saw coming. When one partner dreams of having children and the other physically cannot, life forces you to face a hard choice, a choice that tests everything between two people. Even with all the pressure, John and Susan stayed locked in together, refusing to give up, and they promised to try every option to bring a child into their home. They went to specialists, followed every treatment plan, and kept believing that one day their dream would finally land in their arms. The couple's hopes stayed high, but after years of trying and watching each new attempt fall apart, Susan opened her heart to adoption, even if the baby didn't share their DNA. She felt that love didn't need biology to be real, and John agreed they could still give a child safety, comfort, and a real home. By this point, Susan was a senior nurse in the surgical ICU, respected for her focus and strength, while John was climbing to the top of his legal career with serious momentum. John even received an award from fellow attorneys, honoring his sharp mind, his professionalism, and the way he carried himself in and out of the courtroom. Then, in April 1979, their lives shifted when the Suttons finally got the call they had been praying for: an opportunity to adopt a newborn baby boy just days after his birth. The baby wasn't even born yet, but a loving home was already waiting for him the second he opened his eyes. Every adoptive parent dreams of raising a newborn from day one, wanting to build that bond from the very beginning, and the Suttons were exactly the same. Chris was born on April 13, 1979, and that day became the brightest moment in their lives. They cherished every second with him, pouring love into everything they did. Both Susan and John were determined to give this boy the kind of life they once had: safe, fun, and full of warmth. Chris grew up happy and carefree, running through their big house with pure joy, laughing, playing, and living a life filled with comfort. He had toys stacked everywhere, and on vacations, his parents took him along for every trip, never leaving him behind. Chris was loved deeply, and he gave that love right back. Since he was their only child at the time, he got all the attention, and yes, he was definitely a little spoiled, but in the sweetest way. Suzanne even stepped away from her career just to make sure she could be home with him full-time. Everything felt perfect, but 7 years later, the Suttons realized their family still had space for one more heartbeat. They wanted Chris to have a little sister, and they wanted to experience parenthood again, so they decided to adopt another child. With their first adoption being such a blessing, they felt confident they could give the same love and stability to another baby. Eventually, they adopted a beautiful little girl named Melissa, and with her arrival, they finally felt complete, a family of 4, just like they always imagined. Chris stepped into his role as big brother with pride, showing Melissa love, patience, and loyalty, and the two became close as they grew. Susan and John didn't want secrets in their family, so when the time felt right, they told both Chris and Melissa that they were adopted, speaking honestly and respectfully. It didn't change a thing in the Sutton household. Even though they weren't biologically related, the two children grew up side by side like any other siblings. Chris always protected Melissa, standing up for her if someone bothered her at school or tried to put her down. And through it all, Suzanne and John kept giving their children everything they could, wanting them to grow up in the same comfort and security they were raised in themselves. Some people might say the Suttons were indulging every little wish Chris had, but to his parents it wasn't spoiling, it was simply their way of showing love. Even as Chris got older, Susan and John kept supporting him, paying for his apartment, his car, and anything he needed until he could fully stand on his own. From the outside, this family looked picture perfect, but behind that polished image, something huge was coming. Something unbelievable was about to hit. Something so shocking and unexpected that it would flip their whole world upside down. The ideal family life they built was about to shatter, turning joy into heartbreak and comfort into chaos. By 2004, the Suttons were settled in a stunning waterfront home in Coral Gables. Surrounded by calm water and wealth that reflected years of hard work, they weren't just well off. People saw them as a powerful couple in Miami, respected everywhere they went. John's law firm was booming after 2 decades of grinding in the legal field. He wanted the business to stay in the family, so Susan managed the office side bookkeeping, organization, and anything that kept the firm running smooth. Melissa was 18, freshly in college, chasing a law degree so she could follow in her father's footsteps and step into the courtroom one day. 25-year-old Chris was engaged to Juliet Driscoll, the girl who worked the phones at the firm, and he tried to help with whatever needed to be done. He researched cases, filed documents, handled office tasks, delivered deposits, and tried to show he was ready to build his own place in the family business. Chris and Juliet had met on a family cruise, one of many, because the Suttons lived a lifestyle most people only dream about. John owned 3 yachts, and they took trips to the Caribbean and the Bahamas, diving, fishing, and living that oceanfront life. Juliet learned everything from Susan, who treated her like a daughter-in-law already, guiding her through work and life. Alongside John at the firm was his close colleague and friend, Teddy Monto, one of the few people the Suttons trusted deeply. John respected Teddy so much that he eventually offered him a partnership. John handled litigation against major companies, fighting big cases for corporations, and the money involved wasn't small, it was serious. Their most recent wins brought in 3 massive victories, each worth over $1 million, and the team had every reason to celebrate. They decided to mix business with something personal and use the moment to celebrate Susan's birthday as well. On August 20th, she turned 57, and 2 days later, the celebration dinner took place. Melissa had just started college and couldn't come, but everyone else was there: Mr. and Mrs. Sutton, their son Chris, his fiancée Juliet, and John's partner Teddy. Melissa called her mother again to send love, saying she missed her and hoped the night would be special. For everyone at the table, it felt like just another warm gathering. They enjoyed wine, birthday cake, and easy conversation about their future plans. None of them had even the smallest clue that this peaceful evening was counting down to something terrifying. As the night slowed down, the hosts turned on the TV and watched the Olympics with their guests, letting the celebration fade into quiet comfort. It was getting late, and Chris and Juliet planned to go see a movie. So around 9:30 p.m., they said their goodbyes and stepped out. About 15 minutes later, Teddy also wrapped up the night, thanked the hosts, and headed home. John went into the master bedroom to watch a little more TV before calling it a night. Susan finished up her last chores, making sure the house was settled so she could relax too. Because John snored loudly, Susan usually slept in their son's old room across the hall so she could get some proper rest without waking up every few minutes. Before drifting off, she got on the phone with a close friend, chatting about life as she prepared to end her night peacefully. At some point, John thought he heard a door slam downstairs, or maybe something heavy fall, but he didn't even have time to figure out what it was before everything exploded into chaos. The bedroom door suddenly blasted open, and a figure dressed head to toe in black stormed inside and pointed a gun straight at him. All John could process were the non-stop bangs echoing around the room like thunder. He scrambled desperately, trying to dodge the shots, but bullets still found him before he could even fight back. The room turned into a disaster zone. Instantly, one shot ripped through the headboard, another shattered a mirror, debris flying everywhere. John collapsed to the ground, bleeding heavily, but somehow still holding on to life. Then the intruder turned and headed straight toward Susan's room, leaving John helpless and barely conscious. The wounded husband could do nothing but lie there, listening in horror as more shots tore through the house one after another. Moments later, the gunman came back to John's room and fired 2 more shots at his head before leaving again. Dropping the whole house into silence, John's world went completely dark, but unbelievably, he was still alive. He drifted in and out, barely hanging on, until at some point, consciousness returned. He had no idea what had happened to Susan, whether she was hurt or if the danger was still inside the house. But he knew he needed help immediately. He opened his eyes but saw nothing. Everything was just black. Even in that condition, he forced himself to act, relying on pure memory of the home's layout, stumbling, bleeding, and almost falling with every movement. He managed to reach a phone and dial 911, pushing every bit of strength he had left into that call for help. Adrenaline carried him further despite his injuries. He somehow opened the front door for police when they arrived. Officers quickly realized he was in critical shape and rushed him to Miami's trauma center, his body covered in injuries across his arms, face and torso with blood still flowing from his head. Doctors moved fast, fighting to keep him alive while not knowing if they could save him. Meanwhile, police searched the Sutton home, trying to figure out how the intruder got inside. The sliding glass door leading to the pool was open, and detectives believed the attacker may have entered through it. They weren't sure if the scratches on the door were old or made during the break-in, but the details stood out. Officers walked down the long hallway leading to the bedrooms, checking each space to make sure the attacker wasn't still hiding somewhere in the large home. In the hallway, they spotted shell casings, broken glass, and trails of blood, clear signs of the violent attack. But one thing was missing: Susan. She wasn't in the main bedroom, and panic began to rise among the detectives. Inside the bedroom, investigators noticed items on the dresser wallets, money, jewelry, all untouched. Nothing was stolen, which meant this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. When officers approached Susan's bed, they noticed a pile of blankets filled with bullet holes, a sight that made every detective pause. They pulled back the covers, and a heartbreaking scene appeared in front of them. Suzanne was still holding the corners of the blankets over her head, as if she had tried to shield herself from the attack, hoping to protect her life in those final moments. But the bullets had been too much for her to survive. She lay on her back, and next to her was a phone covered in blood, showing she had tried to call for help too. Injuries were severe, and the room showed signs of a brutal struggle. Police were stunned. This was Coral Gables, a wealthy community where violent crime almost never happened. To see something this extreme inside a home like theirs left detectives shocked and questioning who could possibly carry out an attack this ruthless. Why had this family been targeted? Detectives stood inside that shattered home, feeling the weight of something that looked personal. It was planned and deliberate, like someone walked in with one intention only: end the Suttons' lives. While Susan's body was transported to the coroner for an autopsy, John was fighting for his life in emergency surgery. Doctors discovered 6 separate bullet wounds across his body, each one showing how violent the attack had been. 2 of the shots struck his head, 1 bullet entered through his right temple and tore its way out through his lower jaw. He lost the tip of his ring finger, and another shot went clean through his right thumb. On top of that, 1 more bullet was still lodged somewhere in his chest, adding even more danger to his already critical condition. Detectives, walking room to room, started off with a theory that Jan, a lawyer who understood crime scenes, might tried to harm Susan and staged the attack on himself. At that moment, they didn't know how severe John's condition truly was. But that theory collapsed the second doctors delivered their findings. The head wounds alone proved no person thinking clearly would ever shoot themselves in the temple. To fake anything, no chance. Meanwhile, Melissa had absolutely no idea tragedy had crashed into her family. It was her first day of college, the beginning of a new chapter, while her father was fighting for life and her mother was already gone. A friend suddenly called Melissa to offer condolences, and that's how she learned in the worst way imaginable what horror had unfolded inside her home. Panicked and crying, she began calling her brother Chris. Then their close family friend Teddy, trying to reach anyone who could tell her more, but nobody picked up. After some time, Teddy finally called her back, then drove out to pick her up and take her straight to Miami to see her father. Later that morning, Chris pulled up to the crime scene and saw police cars surrounding his parents' home, lights flashing everywhere. He walked toward officers, confused, scared, and trying to understand what was going on. After identifying himself, the officers told him the devastating truth: his mother had passed, and his father was barely holding on in the hospital. Hearing those words shattered him completely. He broke down, overwhelmed by the fact that just hours earlier they were celebrating his mother's birthday, laughing and eating cake hand. Now she was gone forever. With tears running down his face, Chris rushed straight to the hospital, desperate to reach his father's side. But the news waiting for him there was just as heartbreaking. Doctors told the family the surgery lasted 14 hours, pushing every limit they had, but they couldn't save John's eyesight. The damage to his head was just too severe. John would never see daylight again, never see the faces of his children, and most likely would never be able to step into a courtroom or live the life he had built for decades. Chris and Melissa stayed by their father's bedside, talking to him gently, letting him know he was on T alone, but neither of them knew how to tell him what had happened to the woman he spent 29 years loving. John was kept in a medically induced coma, giving his body a chance to survive the trauma. Over the next weeks, he slowly began drifting toward consciousness. Then one day, he finally managed to whisper a few words. The very first thing he wanted to know was how Susan was doing. Melissa froze, knowing the truth would destroy him instantly at his weakest moment. She couldn't tell her father that his wife was gone. It would have been too dangerous for his health, and stress alone could take his life. Holding back tears, she lied to protect him, saying Mom wasn't doing as well as he was, hoping that small bit of comfort would keep him steady. Hiding the truth was painful, but medically, emotionally, and mentally, it was the only way to keep John alive. Investigators visited John every day, waiting for the moment he'd finally be able to speak, hoping he could give them even the smallest detail about the attack. But because he was on heavy medication and drifting in and out, that moment didn't come for a long time. Meanwhile, detectives interviewed everyone they could, family, friends, even people at the law firm, trying to figure out who would dare carry out something this extreme. A lawyer as successful as John could have serious enemies, so they listened closely when Juliet, Chris's fiancée, mentioned a heated situation he had been involved in recently. She said John had just won a case that caused one client's ex-wife to lose a big amount of money, and bailiffs had stormed into her office, clearing everything out. That happened only days before the shooting, and the woman was furious. So furious, she allegedly threatened John's life. According to witnesses, she stormed into the law firm shouting, saying she would get a gun and shoot him herself. Multiple people saw the altercation. It wasn't just a rumor. Then another detail came in from a neighbor who lived near the waterway behind the Suttons' home. That person heard a boat engine late that night, which raised eyebrows because no one saw or heard any car near the houses when the attack occurred. And the woman who threatened John just happened to own a boat docked near his home. It looked like a perfect setup, but investigators checked the lead and it fell apart fast. She wasn't even in the state that night, and security footage confirmed her boat never left the dock. Detectives had no choice but to move on and keep digging. During the next few weeks, John floated between consciousness and silence while friends and family stayed at his bedside, hoping the father they loved would finally wake up enough to speak. What shocked detectives most was how few clues they had found inside that massive home. No fingerprints showed up on the sliding glass door the intruder used to get inside. The shell casings in the hallway matched a 9mm pistol, but the actual weapon was nowhere to be found. Investigators were also curious about who Susan had been talking to before she went to sleep, and whether that person heard anything that could help the case. They dug through police reports from the night of the attack, searching for anything they missed. That's when they discovered that officers had spotted Teddy Monteau near the Sutton home and he had arrived before emergency services. That immediately raised questions. Could the attacker have come back to the scene? How did Teddy know something was wrong at the Sutton house before the police even got there? And could he have left the sliding door unlocked earlier that evening? Detectives brought Monteau in and questioned him directly. He explained his side of the night, and suddenly the picture shifted because the person Susan had been talking to before bed was Teddy himself? That alone made the situation look strange. What would a married woman be discussing with her husband's business partner at that hour? Teddy insisted nothing improper was happening. He told officers the Suttons were like family to him, and that he and Susan had always been close in a friendly, supportive way. During their call, he said, he suddenly heard a loud sound, something sharp and powerful that made him freeze because it sounded exactly like a gunshot. Then the line suddenly went dead, cutting off the call completely. Teddy tried calling back again and again, but no one answered. And fear started pushing at him. He was convinced something serious might have happened to Susan. He quickly threw on his clothes, jumped in his car, and drove straight to the Suttons' house to make sure everything was okay. But police weren't convinced by his explanation, and suspicion kept tightening around him. Investigators questioned Melissa about the family's relationships, and she confirmed that Teddy wasn't just an employee, he was like a godfather to them, someone deeply trusted. She explained that she and her mother talked work with him constantly, morning till night, and that nothing about their communication felt unusual. Still, detectives sensed something in Teddy's story didn't quite fit. Then he admitted he owned a 9mm firearm, the same caliber used in the attack. Police immediately seized the gun for testing. Teddy also admitted he had been target shooting the day before, meaning there could be gunshot residue on his hands and clothes, which only made detectives look at him even harder. An experienced shooter could easily hit someone moving around a room, just like John had been during the attack. And on top of that, Teddy had a potential motive: money, power, and the chance to take control of the entire firm if John was gone. Because of all this, Teddy was asked to take a polygraph, and he agreed. His gun was sent to the lab to compare the casings to those found in the Sutton hallway. The lie detector test showed he wasn't telling the truth about his relationship with Susan, and after feeling the pressure, Teddy finally admitted that there was more between them than friendship. But even with that confession, he still had an alibi that couldn't be ignored. Cell phone records proved he was at home during the call with Susan, not lurking near the Sutton residence. And the casings from his pistol didn't match the ones found at the scene, eliminating his weapon as the murder gun. Once again, a solid-looking lead fell apart. As reality sank in, Melissa and Chris suddenly realized something terrifying: the killer could be someone close or someone tied to one of John S. cases who might try to come back. Chris begged hospital staff to use a fake name for his father and to block anyone from entering his room, terrified the attacker might return to finish the job. Investigators did their part too. They checked every family member's alibi one by one. Melissa was at college 5 hours away, and Chris had been at the movies with Juliet. He even kept his ticket stub as proof. Detectives went straight to the theater and reviewed surveillance footage, confirming Chris and Juliet had indeed been there during the time of the attack. By early September, John finally began recovering after several intense surgeries. And all he wanted was to go home, but that hope collapsed instantly when he was finally told the truth about Susan. He couldn't accept it. He had survived believing he'd see his wife again. John sat there on the hospital bed, blind, heartbroken, and trying to process a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. His children stood beside him with their hearts breaking too, watching their father lose everything at once. And then, only a short time later, he had to face another devastating truth. Susan had been having an affair with Teddy. Going back to the house where all of this happened was something John simply didn't have the strength to do. So Chris and Juliet invited John to stay in their nearby townhouse, trying to give him safety, comfort, and support during the darkest moment of his life. After all, the townhouse belonged to John anyway, and this was Chris's chance to give something back after all the years his father had carried the family. During the day, a staff nurse cared for John, and Chris and Juliet handled errands, driving him to every appointment and making sure he had what he needed. Months passed, Christmas arrived, and yet no one had been arrested. That's when John did something nobody expected. He went back to work. Even blind, even broken, he dove straight into hearings, reopened old cases, and revived his law firm with a determination that shocked everyone around him. Work became his escape, the place where he could hold on to his identity and avoid sinking into hopelessness. But things weren't peaceful, far from it. Strange things began happening around John, almost as if someone wanted to push him over the edge. One day, while on vacation, Melissa grabbed the keys to her father's car to drive him to the doctor and nearly caused a terrible accident. Mechanics discovered all the lug nuts on the left front wheel had been deliberately loosened, which meant someone had intentionally tampered with the car. When John eventually returned to his own home and tried adjusting to living alone, the strange incidents escalated even more. The alarm system began blaring at random hours, day or night, with no warning at all. Imagine being a blind man, alone in a quiet house, and hearing an alarm explode out of nowhere every single time. Panic would slam into him like a wave. John called for repairs, hoping it was just a technical problem, but the repairman discovered the wires had been cut on purpose. The team fixed the damage, but by the very next day, it happened again. It was clear someone wanted to torment John, either push him into fear or push him into the grave. Meanwhile, detectives kept grinding through the investigation, interviewing every client from John's law firm who had ever lost a case or held a grudge. Everyone had an alibi. Over 20 years of practice, John had been threatened before, but none of those threats ever led anywhere. Investigators were stuck with stacks of case files, crime scene photos, lists of potential suspects, and polygraph results, but still no clear answer. They reviewed every detail repeatedly, searching for anything they had missed. Then finally, a breakthrough came out of nowhere. Police made an arrest, but in a completely unrelated case. A man named Garrett Kopp had threatened a man with a firearm nearly 50 kilometers away from the Sutton residence. When detectives checked the gun, everything changed instantly. Gun analysis revealed the pistol Kopp used was the exact same weapon used in the attack on John and Susan Sutton. Detectives immediately asked, who was Garrett, and why would he target a lawyer's family? Kopp claimed he had bought the gun on the street from a stranger, and maybe that could have been believable if not for one unbelievable coincidence. Garrett had been to the Sutton home before many times. He had done odd jobs around the property, and the one who hired him was none other than Chris, the Sutton's own son. Investigators learned Chris and Garrett met when Chris and Juliet moved into the same housing complex where Coppa's family lived. The two young men became close quickly. Too close. Garrett had no steady job and needed money, so Chris hired him off in gardening, small repairs, odd tasks, anything to help him out. A friendship formed, but detectives noticed something unusual about their connection. It wasn't normal friendship intensity. These two called each other around 300 times a month, even for tight friends. That number didn't look ordinary at all. Hey. And then detectives uncovered another layer. Garrett had reasons to resent the Suttons. Maybe he envied their comfortable lifestyle, their family bond, or the opportunities Chris had at his fingertips. But investigators didn't believe Garrett pulled off the attack alone. The details were too specific, the timing too calculated, and the entry method too precise. And when detectives finally turned their full attention to Chris Sutton, the son who was at a movie theater the night of the attack, or so everyone believed. Chris and Garrett had called each other 13 times that day, and the final call came right after the movie ended, at the exact moment Susan was already gone and John was fighting for his life. That timing alone hit detectives like a warning siren. Then there was another moment that suddenly looked suspicious. Chris's reaction to the tragedy. He was shaken, yes, but right alongside the tears, immediately reached into his pocket, pulled out the movie ticket stub, and handed it to an officer even though nobody had asked for it. You have to admit, it's strange to rush to prove your alibi right after hearing your mother is dead and your father is in the hospital clinging to life." At first, detectives didn't think twice about it, but with new information coming in, that gesture took on a whole new meaning. And now, investigators wanted to hear stories from the people who truly knew Chris' family friends. Co-workers, anyone who had seen the real dynamic inside the Sutton home. Once they heard those accounts, detectives realized they were finally moving toward the truth. Behind the closed doors of the Sutton home, nobody knew exactly what went on, but one thing was clear. Susan and John had fought passionately to become parents. They adored baby Chris from the moment he arrived, and they poured every bit of their love into him. But as the years passed, the child they adored showed a very different side. By age 13, Chris's behavior shifted dramatically. His grades dropped, homework stopped, and the troubled teenage phase never smoothed out. It doubled down on chaos. His problems got worse, and he was kicked out of every school his parents transferred him to. At home, his anger started exploding, walls damaged, items smashed, and violent outbursts that terrified the family. At one point, Chris attacked Susan, grabbing her and trying to choke her, something no parent ever expects from their child. The Suttons were desperate for answers, so they turned to specialist psychologists, psychiatrists, pediatricians, hoping someone could explain what was happening. Doctors diagnosed Chris with ADHD, and one specialist said he had oppositional defiant disorder, a condition where a child constantly clashes with parents, teachers, and authority figures. The disorder shows through arguments, tantrums, and intense irritability. It often develops when a child gets sympathy instead of boundaries, so the negative behavior becomes a tool for attention. Susan and John tried everything: therapy, medication, structure, support, but nothing seemed to help. Then one day, Chris and two friends caused $50,000 worth of damage to a teacher's home, spray painting walls and destroying furniture. That alone showed how far things had spiraled, but the situation didn't stop there. The final straw came when Chris picked up John's .22 caliber rifle, walked into the living room and pointed it at Susan and Melissa. The gun wasn't loaded, but Susan and her daughter had no idea. They were terrified, frozen in shock. Instead of punishing Chris harshly, John simply sent him to his room, hoping discipline would calm things down. But the issues were only growing darker. At 16, things escalated once more. Susan discovered a letter Chris wrote, describing how he wanted to end his parents' lives to get his inheritance. Chris brushed it off as a joke, but the words on the page were chilling. Still, his parents couldn't fully believe their son would truly harm them. They thought it was anger, confusion, or teenage impulsiveness, not a real threat. But when Chris got involved with drugs, everything changed. Susan and John realized they couldn't ignore the signs anymore. They needed serious intervention, because their son's behavior had crossed into a place where the danger could no longer be dismissed. One doctor confirmed that Chris was developing clear psychopathic tendencies, warning the Suttons that things could end in tragedy if they didn't take action immediately. Susan and John panicked and began researching every option: boarding schools, shelters, and treatment centers dedicated to troubled teens. After weeks of searching, they finally settled on a place called Paradise Cove, a so-called reform program built to fix teenagers with serious behavioral problems. Paradise Cove was located in remote American Samoa, deep in the South Pacific, far from distractions, as far from civilization, and far from anything familiar. It opened in the early 90s and claimed to help boys rebuild their lives, but behind the sales pitch, the methods used there were extremely questionable. Their system relied on intimidation, scaring the teens into obedience, forcing control, and breaking down their will from day one. Chris was 16 when everything changed overnight. Huge men stormed into his bedroom in the middle of the night, restrained him, and forced him onto a plane headed for that distant island. In reality, the Suttons had arranged what felt like a kidnapping, legally approved, but emotionally devastating. John, being a lawyer, secured a restraining order against his own son, and then a court order allowing Chris to be removed and placed in re-education. The Suttons were promised an academic program, weekly reports, and professional supervision. They believed they were sending their rebellious son to a tropical place with no temptations. Quiet island, where he could learn discipline, appreciate the simple things, and finally stop taking life for granted. After finishing the program, they hoped he would return home as a changed young man who understood their love. Susan and John even visited American Samoa before agreeing to send Chris there, wanting to see the island with their own eyes. They paid a massive amount of money, trusting that professionals would help shape their son into someone healthier, calmer, and more stable. But they couldn't have been more wrong. Paradise only existed in the name and the postcard scenery. The people running the camp were nothing like educators. They abused their power, treating the boys in ways that were emotionally and physically harmful. Paradise Cove was more like a prison for troubled teens, not a therapeutic program. The camp was unsanitary, with scabies lice and ringworms spreading among the residents. For even the smallest mistake, the boys were humiliated, verbally, physically, and psychologically. Teens were put in solitary confinement, restrained hand and foot, and deprived of food as punishment. The owner denied everything, insisting that abuse never happened. But multiple lawsuits and investigations later proved otherwise. The government of Samoa eventually shut the program down, unable to ignore the evidence any longer. When the Suttons were finally allowed to visit Chris a year after he was taken, he looked stronger and fitter, and he greeted his parents with a smile. Chris tried to tell them about the harsh treatment and painful experiences he'd gone through, hoping they would believe him this time. But Susan and John thought he was manipulating them again, falling back into old behaviors. According to the agreement, Chris had to complete the entire program before coming home. So the Suttons convinced themselves that this strict environment would help him change for the better. He saw him playing volleyball, swimming in the ocean, laughing with other boys into them. It looked like he was genuinely happy to see them. They believed he was moving in the right direction, completely unaware of the damage happening behind the scenes. So they left Chris in that place for another year, trapped in conditions no parent would ever imagine for their child. They didn't believe his warnings about the harsh life there, and in the end, that became their biggest mistake in the whole Paradise Cove situation. You can understand why Susan and John made that choice. They saw the reform school as their last real chance to help a teenager who seemed completely out of control. Their actions came from love, not malice. They wanted to save their son, not hurt him. But they truly had no idea what Chris was going through every single day. The whole mindset behind the program was to force the boys into appreciating normal life by putting them through strict, sometimes brutal routines. The teens followed a rigid schedule, stayed constantly busy, exercised non-stop, and did everything under supervision. They weren't allowed to take one step without permission, not even to shower or use the bathroom. The program required them to pass 6 levels before completion, and each level came with a few more freedoms. Only at the higher levels could the boys call home and speak to their parents. Education was practically non-existent. Every student had to teach himself from whatever materials he could find because there were no certified teachers at all. This wasn't a school, it was survival. Chris Sutton spent 2.5 years in Paradise Cove, and he was only allowed to return home the day after his 19th birthday thanks to his lawyer father fighting to bring him back. When he came home, it looked like the young man was finally settling into a normal rhythm again. He finished high school, grew up a little, acted more mature, and showed a calmer side to everyone around him. As a gift to reset the family bond, they took a cruise to the British Virgin Islands, and during that trip, Chris met Juliet. Susan and John hoped this relationship would keep Chris grounded, help him focus, and give him something positive to hold on to. A year later, the parents even bought the couple a place in Miami. Chris went to college and Juliet started working at John S. Law Firm. Susan treated Juliet like a second daughter, teaching her how to dress well, choose makeup, and pick jewelry. She truly embraced her as family. John welcomed her warmly too, accepting her into their lives as if she'd always been part of the Sutton story. Chris had been a troubled teen when he was shipped off to that island school, but years had passed and accusing him of attacking his parents didn't feel fair at first glance. For a while, it looked like he was rebuilding a normal, peaceful relationship with his family. But later, the truth became impossible to ignore. Chris hadn't changed at all. Some people don't change. They simply learn how to hide their intentions, adapt their behavior, and wait for the right time to strike back. Deep down, Chris never forgave Susan and John for sending him to Paradise Cove. Investigators asked John straight up if he believed his son could have been involved in the attack, and he immediately shut that idea down. He insisted Chris had been by his side non-stop, helping him through blindness, doing chores, and taking care of him. Juliet, Chris's fiancée, said the same thing. Chris depended on his parents for almost everything. even at age 25. They paid for his car, his apartment, his studies, and he was extremely close to them. To dig deeper, detectives arrested Garrett Kopp for the attempted murder and put pressure on him through intense questioning. At first, he denied everything, but officers spoke to his ex-girlfriend, and she revealed something alarming on the night of the attack. Garrett came home and burned his clothes. When she asked why, he admitted he had been involved in the crime. Faced with evidence and realizing his only chance was cooperation, Garrett finally cracked. He confessed to shooting the Suttons and placed the blame on Chris. According to him, he and Chris had been involved in using and selling drugs together, and they had several illegal schemes running to make money. Garrett claimed Chris pushed for everything, because now his own future depended on cutting the best deal he could with police. Chris had never forgiven Susan and John for sending him to Paradise Cove in the first place. He wanted revenge. And on top of that, he wanted the life insurance payouts. He promised Garrett $100,000 if everything went smoothly and his parents were gone. On March 26, 2005, detectives finally secured a warrant for Christopher Sutton's arrest. Though there was no concrete physical evidence tying Chris directly to the crime, just the testimony of Garrett Kopp, the man who actually pulled the trigger, Christopher still tried to flee. Police stopped him before he could escape and took him straight to jail. The only person who could truly speak against Chris was his fiancée, Juliet Driscoll. Detectives needed her to reveal whether Chris had ever spoken about harming his own parents. Susan had treated Juliet like a second mother, always guiding her, dressing her up, giving her care. So Juliet knew she had no right to protect someone who might have taken Susan's life. She faced the hardest decision she had ever known: help bring justice for the woman who had stood by her, or stay silent and help Chris avoid the consequences. Overwhelmed, Juliet broke down in tears and finally revealed the truth. Chris had been planning this for years, she said. He never forgave his parents for sending him to that island program, never let go of the anger he carried deep inside. At their last dinner together, Susan argued with Chris over car insurance, telling him she wouldn't keep financing his lifestyle, and that it was time for him to take responsibility. That moment sent Chris into a rage. Investigators believe he snapped right then, called Garrett, and left the sliding patio door unlocked so the shooter could slip in unnoticed. The trial finally began in July 2010. Chris had an excellent lawyer, but even that wasn't enough to convince the jury. Another witness even stepped forward, saying Chris had asked him to find a hitman for his parents, adding even more weight to the case. The trial lasted 3 long weeks, forcing the Sutton family to relive every painful moment from 5 years earlier. On July 22, 2010, the jury found Christopher Patrick Sutton guilty of murdering his adoptive mother and attempting to murder his adoptive father. He received life in prison without the possibility of parole, an ending that crushed everyone involved. John Sutton addressed the court with heartbreaking honesty, saying there were no winners in this tragedy. He reminded everyone that he had lost Susan, that he had lost Christopher long before the crime, and that he had also lost his eyesight. In his words, everyone lost something that night, and nothing could ever bring back what was taken. Today, John's life has finally stabilized despite his blindness. He returned to practicing law, rebuilt his firm, and refused to let tragedy define him. He swims, he skis, and he even jokes that he met his new girlfriend on a blind date. John has also invested heavily in vision restoration research, holding on to the hope that one day a miracle might happen and he could see again. Maybe one day he really will see the new life he fought so hard to rebuild. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. You're a real true crime supporter. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, hit the like button, and we'll see you in the next story.